Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this RUSI online event. My name is Jamie McColl, and I'm a research fellow in the Cyber Research Group here at RUSI. This event is the third in a series taking place as part of our ongoing project with King's College London and the University of Bath, Cyber Statecraft in an Era of Systemic Competition. The project aims to create a more solid conceptual and empirical evidence base on cyber statecraft and help better inform the UK government's efforts to shape global cybersecurity and governance. The project and today's event is funded by the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory through the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council in partnership with the Research Institute for Socio-Technical Cybersecurity. For the next hour, our panel will shed light on the UK's experience with cyber statecraft to date and reflect on what the future may hold. The recent election makes this a particularly opportune moment to consider how UK's cyber strategy may change with the first Labour government in 14 years. So to discuss the past, present and future of UK cyber statecraft, I'm going to be joined by a panel of experts from policy, academia and industry, and hopefully their screens will now magically turn on. Professor Alexander Evans teaches technology and public policy at the London School of Economics and directs the MPA in data science for public policy. A career diplomat, he was Director Cyber at the UK Foreign Office from 2018 to 2020, an advisor to the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street from 2020 to 2021, and Director Strategy in the Cabinet Office from 2021 to 2022. Dr. Joseph Devaney is a lecturer in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where he co-convenes the MA in Cyber Strategy and Policy. He was a 2022 to 23 British Academy Innovation Fellow at the UK FCDO and has written extensively on UK national security and cyber policy. Next, Dr. Andrew Dwyer is a lecturer in information security at Royal Holloway, University of London. Andrew's research focuses on the intersection of socio-technical and geopolitical interests in cybersecurity, and he has written some of the best critiques of UK cyber strategy that I've read, and I'd also like to flag that he hopefully has a forthcoming RUSI commentary on that very subject. Last but not least, we have Kat Summer, who is the Group Head of Government Affairs and Analyst Relations at NCC Group, one of the UK's largest cybersecurity vendors. Kat leads NCC's political engagement, government relations and lobbying work, educating policymakers on cybersecurity and internal audiences on political developments. I should say, and I'm sure she'll tell us about this later on when I ask her about the future of government policy. She is helping to spearhead efforts to reform the Computer Misuse Act here in the UK as part of the Cyber Up campaign. So thank you everyone for joining. Joe, I'm going to come to you first, and I apologize if this feels too much like the kind of task that you'd set to one of your MA students on your cyber strategy course. But if you could humour me, so imagine you're briefing a collection of new ministers that have cyber somewhere in their portfolio. How would you summarise the UK's experience with cybersecurity and cyber statecraft to date?
Okay, thank you very much, Jamie, both for inviting me and for giving me that excellent first question, not least because the more qualified other panelists can correct me when I go wrong, and I'm sure my MA students would do this much better. So you're right, we've got a new government. We're sort of watching it form since Friday. But we have about two and a half years left to run on the current cycle of national cyber strategy, and there's no necessary reason with a new government why you would try to rush, doing a wholly new iteration of national strategy before the end of 2026. So that there's no need for a fundamentally new sort of approach to cyber statecraft immediately. But as your question sort of indicates, with a new government, there's definitely an opportunity to do a stock take, to look at, what has been going on, what our priorities are, what's been working well, and what needs to be improved. So I think that's probably the best place to start. And I guess that there's a question there about, if you take an issue, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about later, which is, cybercrime, I guess there are questions about, why is it, that we're not having the effects, we're not having the outcomes that we would want to see? Is that because we're not patient enough, that we need to give more time to the existing lines of effort to bear fruit? Or is it because we're not doing enough of the right things? We're not being imaginative enough. We're not, we don't have enough risk appetite. Or there's that broader question, which is much broader than cybercrime, which is, but is also true of cybercrime, which is that it's a global problem. And the UK itself is not going to be able to solve cybercrime alone. So there are all of those sorts of questions that apply, whatever the sort of the threat, that you're talking about. So, I'd say that the new government ministers, shouldn't just take my word for it. And I just sort of had jotted down, they should think about three things, and they all begin with R. So review, revise, and recommit. So review, I'd say, if you were to go back to the 2009 National Cybersecurity Strategy, the first one, which I guess is a little bit of a geeky thing to do, but I would, commend you to do it. You can get it online. It's a short document. And I'd say actually the top level analysis in that strategy is fairly sound. The outlining, the need to reduce the risk, take the opportunities to build up capability and get the governance and everything, sort of regulatory environment right. The 8 work streams that it outlines, you can see that analysis embedded in every subsequent strategy. So the language changes, some of the prioritization shifts. Obviously, the modalities of how the threats present themselves change, but fundamentally, I think the analysis is sound. But as an incoming government, after however many iterations of national strategy and 15 years, you definitely need to take stock, to look at what we're trying to do now, what is working, what isn't working, and that should then feed into the second R, which is revise. So I say revise rather than sort of revolt or revolution, because I think it's much easier to look at things incrementally in the short term, where we need to change things, but thinking about what the process is to help you to identify where the changes are that are needed, but also to think through what I guess the first and second order sort of impacts of those changes might be, the wider system effects, and how everything sort of fits together. Because the new government has already committed, doing a defense strategic review or a defense and security review, a sort of separate, what do they call it, like a security sprint, and all of those things you would think to some extent would overlap, because the threats will have cyber dimensions, or changes that you might want to make, in existing cyber statecraft might have changes that that are relevant to some of those, whether it's countering state threats or whatever else. So think about what you want to change, but also think about the implications of the changes that you're thinking about making. And then lastly, recommit, which is a slightly sort of more like stranger way of phrasing it, but basically I think what we've seen over 15 years is incremental progress, more momentum, more priority for cyber threats. And it's important not to lose that momentum, not to lose that sense of priority, whilst also creating the time and the space to reflect and review and revise. And I think that is really important. So I think in terms of sort of the international dimensions of cyber statecraft, the UK's experience of it, I sort of pick out 3 things. I think cyber capacity building plays a much bigger part in cyber strategy today than it did 15 years ago. And I think that's especially over the last 10 years. I think we've seen a significant increase in that. And that is essentially sort of 10 or 15 years worth of lessons to be learned, and making ourselves and the wider sort of capacity building community better at doing capacity building. I think that clearly pays off, both for the countries that are being assisted, but also for the UK and for everyone, whether it's the kind of rising tide floats all boats scenario, but also, the more capacity in more countries, then the better able they are to cooperate, whether it's in sort of international law enforcement sort of operations, sharing intelligence, or just contributing in global cyber diplomacy forums. So I think, its capacity building is important. And I think the UK has a good story to tell about that. But like most things, that are sort of incremental achievements over a period of time, you can't just sort of assume that that's going to continue through time. You've got to stay committed to it, and keep on improving. I think the broader foreign policy and diplomacy input into UK cyber strategy has also increased across that time. There is a line there about the international dimensions of of cyber strategy in the 2009 document, but it's become bigger over time. And particularly, I think, in the last iteration, it really had a significant sort of place in what the UK was trying to do in cyber strategy. But again, I think not to neglect that, to sort of to build on that, particularly in the FCDO, sort of the investment in cyber policy department into international technology, that's something to build on and not to neglect, to nurture and support it. And then lastly, this idea of offensive operations having been, I think over the last 15 years, I think we talk more about cyber operations than we did. And I think we say more thoughtful things about it. And there is a very definite UK sort of decision to make a play for thought leadership in the responsible cyber power sort of field. And it's an open question. I think, what the UK does next there with that, there was the National Cyber Force paper, I'm sure we'll talk about later, responsible cyber power in practice. But what does the next phase look like? And that's, to some extent, that might be a new government having an opportunity to think about it. But also, I just think government itself, the different institutions within the UK government will have different things to say about where to go next with that. And it almost doesn't matter, whether you call it cyber power or you call it something else. What's important is the wider trend that reflects, both in terms of international engagement, but also sort of the domestic audience. And I think there are both domestic and international audiences for a lot of these strategic communications. So, I mean, if I've got the time, I just thought it would be useful to actually just address that question of when we talk about cyber statecraft, what do we mean? Because I think statecraft
that'd be useful just for the
audience. So it's a bit of a niche word. It's an academic word. I guess you don't really use it in other contexts. Whereas something like strategy, I think, is used and understood more universally. So strategy is about setting your objectives, prioritizing between them, aligning your kind of resources and effort, ends, ways, and means. What's the relationship between statecraft and strategy? And I'd say that statecraft is essentially the sort of the dynamic practice aspect of it, not just in the way that you do strategy, but in the way that you execute and implement it. So for cyber statecraft, that's sort of pursuing your national interests, your objectives, your prosperity and values in and through cyberspace. So the in and through sort of sounds a bit sort of US military. I think it's relevant because cyber statecraft has both cyber specific objectives. So I don't know, operationally, you might want to dismantle kind of adversary infrastructure. In diplomatic terms, you want to shape the global debate about norms of responsible behavior. So those are cyber specific, but I think cyber statecraft also, potentially has non-cyber objectives. So, what is the value of cyber operations? In a non-cyber sense, it might be the value of cyber operations to produce intelligence, that is actionable in the real world. So, to help you make decisions, to make an arrest, to target sanctions, to make a policy decision. So I think it's about thinking about the utility of cyber across all of the different sort of levers and instruments you have in government, but also about coordinating both within government and within the wider national systems of government and the private sector, but also internationally, because your allies and partners will have their own cyber statecraft, and you want to coordinate with them as much as possible. And it's also competitive because your adversaries or your challengers also have their cyber statecraft approaches. So you have to understand what the impact of those approaches are on your own approach to statecraft, and also think about the way you can use your statecraft to sort of disrupt and frustrate what they're trying to do in and through cyberspace. So it's about orchestration, coordination, collaboration with allies and partners, but it's also fundamentally competitive. So it's about trying to work out where you are in relation to other countries or non-state actors, and reflect on that. So it's collaborative, but also competitive. And the UK, has a good story to tell about doing a number of dimensions of cyber statecraft well. But there are also some big issues that I think obviously we will talk about where the UK needs to do better. And that's probably an appropriate point to stop.
Great, thank you so much, Joe. Just before I ask a follow-up, just a reminder to the audience that we will be taking questions from the audience later on. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A function at any point. Just a sort of general question, Joe, when thinking about the sort of history of UK cyber strategy and cyber statecraft, I mean, how good do you think the UK government and civil service is at learning from the past? I mean, you mentioned all the way back to the 2009 strategy, and I remember the first paper I did at RUSI, which was on cyber insurance, there'd been a really good Cabinet Office report from 2015, 2016 on cyber insurance. None of the recommendations had been implemented, and it was impossible for me to find anyone to talk to who had been involved in the drafting of that document to try and find out the kind of, I don't know, what work had been done to go into it and any reflections from them on why the recommendations hadn't been implemented.
Yeah, no, that's a fair question and a good one. I think as an academic, and you'll have the same sort of perspective experience as a think tank researcher, that it is bewildering, the amount of output that there is in terms of new reports or articles or books. It's there's constantly new material. But I think during my my fellowship, sort of being able to see how the FCDO was sort of doing cyber diplomacy, I kind of realized that actually for practitioners, it's that experience is even truer, because there's even less time to devote to reading that sort of literature, because that's not your day job. So the challenge is to try to translate the key messages from that material into something that policymakers can use, be aware of, and B, then sort of act on the awareness in a constructive way. So I think that is important. I guess curation of institutional memory. So I think your question also had that dimension to it, which is there's a lot that is produced within governments, and maybe sometimes A, because of the pace, but B, because of churn, or because of something was produced by one institution and not another. So there are lots of coordination problems there. But I think, if you think about the last 15 years, there are probably quite a few people still left in the system who are around for the 2009 strategy and every subsequent strategy. So because it is a relatively new sort of field with, or not a new field, I guess you can talk about cyber having a 20, 30, 40 year sort of time horizon, but actually the stuff that we're talking about is more like the last 15 years. So actually it still ought to be possible to sort of excavate and find a lot of those memories and experiences, but you don't, unless you do it, it doesn't sort of happen serendipitously. So yeah, it is definitely a challenge that I think people are aware of, but I think it is genuinely hard to do.
And Alexander, as someone that has worked in this space in government for a while, are there any, if we go all the way back to the kind of 2009 strategy to the next three, are there any kind of recurring cyber policy challenges that kind of every government has had to try and grapple with and solve?
Well, Jamie, thanks very much, and thanks for the invite to come along today. It's a really good subject and a good time to be convening this RUSI discussion. And big shout out as well to the quality of RUSI analysis on these issues in your own work, really valuable. So look, I mean, I guess sort of picking up on what Joe has said. I mean, if we gaze back, there is that problem that Joe's well articulated, but in government, last week was a long time ago. Yesterday is a distant memory, and what happened in 2009, that's ancient history. And when archaeologists come into government, they tend to work on policy portfolios rather than trying to find the prehistory of cyber diplomacy or anything else. So there is a real problem. But like many large complex institutions, trying to find make sure that you've got that institutional history, that institutional memory, that you do have people who can tell you how we got here and some of the way stations along the way is really important. And I would argue that becomes more important, not less, as the agenda becomes more complex. But some things have always been true. Look, technology is both exciting for politicians, but also a subject of great mystery to many politicians, as it is to many bureaucrats as well, many officials, right? There aren't necessarily a huge number of senior officials with backgrounds in technology or cyber. And often there's a disjoint between the people who really know the stuff, which are going to be people at senior executive officer, higher executive officer, grade 7, grade 6 in the civil service. So military terms of lieutenant colonel or colonel and below, and the people actually making senior level decisions and advice who are sort of in the senior civil service or at 1-star to 4-star in the military. And then the politicians who actually have to make the really fundamental choices for UK PLC and for the UK state. So I think that disjoint and the memory problem is persistently there. What some of the stuff on the in tray that was true in 2009 and is true now? Well, one of it is you want to be proactive on lots of this agenda. You want to set out a stall, set out a plan, build capability, take advantage of what I think is true, which is that the UK is a full spectrum cyber actor in a way that's credible and evidence-based, as distinct from sometimes some other claims that are made about the UK. That having been said, if you're a minister coming in, part of the problem you have is almost everything that's going to bubble up to you is going to be important, urgent, and reactive. Minister, I'm really sorry, but we are grappling with a ransomware attack on this bit of the NHS. Minister, I'm really sorry, but we're dealing with a hostile cyber attack and advanced persistent threat. Here's what we know. What kind of decisions do you want to make given the attribution information that we can give you internally within government? What do you want to say publicly? Do you want to carry through into statements or sanctions or other forms of action? I think what's materially different now is the scale compared to 2009. And the fact that cyber in general has moved from already being a kind of important issue, but not always consistently tier one, to being a persistent tier one issue for government. And you see that you see that in terms of at least I realize this is external reporting. I don't know how true it was, but COBRA meetings, the Cabinet Office briefing room emergency response apparently was activated more times linked to ransomware incidents in 2022 than anything else. If true, that's substantive. You see it in the context of the fact that not only did the Sunak government and the Johnson government before it, I'm going to pass for a moment on the Liz Truss government, but to elevate science and technology and cyber sort of to tier one issues at national strategy and for domestic competitive advantage. But you're seeing that articulated also for Labour as an incoming government. Patrick Vallance, the former chief scientific advisor, has been appointed a Minister of State in the new government, is telling. So if I was to pick out sort of two things about the past that relate to the present challenge, one is you want to be proactive and have time for strategy and strategy to shape your statecraft. But the reality of government is an awful lot of government is reactive and it's dealing with the crises or emergencies of the moment. And the second thing is trying to think about it's everything everywhere all at once. It's how do you factor in the challenges of AI into some of this. Now, of course, this is like one of these bingo games. It's 23 minutes into the webinar. We've mentioned AI, but you don't get extra points for that. I don't get a prize at the end. I don't get a book voucher or I suppose a Bitcoin credit voucher is really what I'd be after. But there is something here about what are the implications of AI for accelerating the pace of challenge on cybersecurity. What does it mean for command and control within the civilian infrastructure of government, within the private sector? I'm sure we'll hear from Kat on that in a moment, but also, frankly, around critical national infrastructure. What does it mean around cybercrime and ransomware? A growing problem, but a growing problem if basically the shortcuts to be able to develop effective ransomware are much shorter because of the ability to use Copilot or other tools for coding. What does it mean for disinformation? What does it mean for child sexual abuse imagery, hybrid imagery that may be AI manipulated online? And these are all issues where the ability to focus on the next as well as the now becomes really important for government. And the ability not only for government to do that in isolation, but for all the different bits of government that Joe was talking about, not only be able to work across government, but also to be able to work effectively with private sector, the wider public sector, and with international partners. And that's a tall order. Joe, I notice that you've got a range of cats behind you. I hope you're going to explain that in a little bit. But if one of the challenges is brigading the cats in government, how do we brigade all the different cats that are involved in this challenge of cybersecurity?
And Alexander, to come from the past to the present, so the current UK national cyber strategy and the kind of framing of the UK as a cyber actor in the integrated review positions the UK as a responsible democratic cyber power. As someone that was in the Cabinet Office at the time, do you have any insights on what influenced that kind of conceptualization of the UK?
Well, look, unlike all the WhatsApp leaks in recent years, strangely, I'm a subscriber to the view that policy advice in government should remain confidential until it gets released to the National Archives. But I'm rather old-fashioned about that, I guess. But I think it's fair to say that if you look at the prioritization, what you've had is something that is slow burn, which is the growth of this agenda to become a strategic policy agenda for all of government. And I think you've seen that over successive governments, and you see that very clearly articulated now. And it raises an interesting question, which is to what extent do we need to be talking about cyber statecraft as something distinct or discrete from statecraft? Because if in essence what we're doing is, if cyber is everything and everything is cyber, in what ways and when is it helpful to distinguish? Question mark. But you asked specifically, Jamie, about this idea of the UK as a responsible democratic cyber power, and I think there, a hat tip has to go to Jeremy Fleming, who was somebody who articulated this very clearly in public and within government at the time. This is a former director of GCHQ, and I think some of the language that you saw around democratic and responsible distinguishes the UK as a responsible, rule of law based democratic actor from some of those countries in the world that are very happy to deploy cyber tools and cyber capabilities and are much less concerned about what's the impact on citizens or what forms of accountability should accompany that use.
Andrew, sort of similar question to you. What do you make of this concept of responsible democratic cyber power, and is it one that you think will have legs with a change of government?
Thank you, first of all, the invitation. And just to echo both previous panelists, actually, there is going to be a lot of legs around responsible cyber power for a long time, because fundamentally, the UK finds itself in a world where there are multiple states that are seeking to increase their cyber power and to disrupt and degrade the UK's position in that, along with other allied states. So I think what Alexander said there around responsibility is key, which is to say the UK had to say something. It had left the European Union. It was in a different place. Cyber power emerged in the milieu of global Britain. And so here you can start to see how cyber power does something for the UK and enables it to say about its offensive cyber operations. So it can actually say, we're going to do this responsibly compared to the likes of Russia or North Korea or other actors that are seen as undesirable. I think the key around responsible cyber power, and especially its democratic element, which is really interesting how that gets changed for different audiences. And we've seen an evolution of the use of democratic to different audiences, depending on whether they're in the global south, etc., which I think is a real development that the FCDO is worked quite hard on there, is what does it mean to be a cyber power and for whom? So I think one of the really interesting things that came out of the late 2010s is this increasing strategic outlook on where the UK goes. What does cyber statecraft look like? Is it just statecraft? And then the question emerges is, well, what underpins the capacity to act, the capacity for statecraft, is the thing that actually seems to get increasingly ignored or less in purview, which is to say, what does a whole of society approach mean here? What does it mean to ask the whole of society what type of cyber power they may wish to have? Who gets to define what cyber power should be and what the strategic direction of the UK should be? And I think one of the examples which have been mentioned a lot in cyber circles is ransomware. That's only come about because it's really attained a national security importance. But for the vast majority of people in the UK, ransomware isn't the problem, it's fraud. And I think this is where cyber power somehow gets tangled, because the UK needs a strategic approach. But what then does that do to the other domestic areas that facilitate that cyber statecraft is really difficult for the incoming government about how it may rebalance or reprioritize, or as Joe mentioned there, around revise. I think it will be revision. It's not going to be revolution, but I think it's about understanding how does cyber power maybe in its efforts to portray to an international audience become increasingly pincer-like in its focus to the point where it starts excluding other perspectives. And I think that's always a challenge in policy, especially on the strategic level, and more so in cyber, because cyber is everything, as Alexander said there. And so how do you deal with that when you've got a very responsive and reactive type of policy making, precisely where cyber requires a non-reactive policy making? And so I think that's a distinction in cyber policy, perhaps to other areas of strategic policy, which I think cyber power gets us somewhere, but in that movement to being able to use different strategic levers, leaves us other areas devoid of that kind of imperative focus that is required.
So is it fair to say, Andrew, that you think ultimately not much, it's not going to be a revolution in terms of how new government positions the UK as a kind of global cyber actor?
I think the arrival of David Lamy as Foreign Secretary is going to be really interesting here. So I was rereading his Fabian pamphlet that he wrote back in 2023 called Britain Reconnected, and that sets the scene for the entire time since and during the general election campaign. And here, one of the things that he says is that global Britain has a sense of a post-imperial hubris. And I think this is where the tone and instinct of Lamy and the broader Labour Party may have some difficulties with the language of power. I'm not sure whether that's going to be the case, but the fundamentals of the broader strategic levers that have been developed by very competent civil service, I would argue here, actually, compared to many other places, mean that actually we might see that kind of, it may be a withdrawal from power, but maybe something else replaces it, which resituates the UK, especially with allies among the global south, which seems to be a real priority for Lamy. So I think here, this is where the Cyber Policy Department in the FCDO will have maybe some interesting conversations, or maybe not. I think it's too early to tell, because really, does cyber ever rise to politicians' interest? If we look at what happened with the hospital ransomware during the election campaign, no would be the case. So is there really a drive from the top to change this in terms of the public image? Maybe not. So I'm unsure, because there are different moving parts about what may happen with Lamy and the new Labour administration.
Right. Just before I come to Kat, given that she and NCC Group have done some excellent work looking at what Labour and other governments in Europe or opposition parties in Europe might be doing in terms of cyber policy, I think the point that Andrew's just raised is a really interesting one. And Joe, I just wanted to ask, do you think that is cybersecurity or cyber policy actually ideological when it comes to governing in the way that other policy areas are? Because in theory, it should pose some quite, substantive questions about the role of the state and the private sector and who has responsibility for that. And if you're thinking about, in theory, a kind of more left-wing government approaching that question, the answer might be, well, this is something that's going to be driven from the centre much more. And actually, the private sector's had a lot of opportunities to try and solve these issues already, and they haven't.
So yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I guess you would already say probably that there, and certainly, in fact, a RUSI paper has said this. Robert Hannigan's what is it? Organizing a Government for Cyber, and the argument in that paper is that that shift already happened in 2016. That there was a period of time when, assuming, and this is, it's kind of caricaturing the period, but the argument is that the government was willing to countenance more market-based solutions for the first iteration of that kind of coalition era cybersecurity strategy, and realized over the course of that period that that wasn't going to be enough. And so the government had to become more active and intervene more to shape sort of cybersecurity outcomes. So you could say that that shift has already been made, and that was within a conservative-led to actually a solely conservative administration. So I don't think that, to answer a different question to the one that you asked, I don't think that there is an ideological difference between this government coming in and the government that has just departed on cybersecurity, which is not the same as to say, how do you think about the relationship between ideology and cybersecurity? So I would not expect them to pursue a sort of a fundamentally different approach, because I don't think there is a fundamental difference between them on that issue. I think a kind of an aligned or associated question is, why isn't cybersecurity more of a politically salient issue? And I think that's a harder question to answer, because I think it should be more salient than it is. Like, just look at the election campaign and, the ransomware attack and the effect on, hospitals and healthcare. And it was very notable that did not become a sort of, a more political hot potato than maybe it could have done, or arguably should have done in the campaign. So I think those are interesting questions. And probably, if you were advising the incoming government, like, would you say confidently that surprisingly sort of lower level of political salience would continue through time? Like, I wouldn't necessarily bet on it, because I think there has to come a point probably when, those sorts of attacks, reach a level where they cut through more, and actually there is more political controversy over, our inability to stop things like that from happening, when it's not like it's a new problem, and it's not even like it's a problem that we haven't been more focused on as a higher priority over the last 6 or 7 years. So I think that there's a legitimate question to ask about how we do better, and whether that becomes more of a political issue, which again I know isn't necessarily thinking about it in ideological terms, but I think it's relevant.
And Kat, so I know you've done work looking at the Labour or all the parties' manifestos and what they might mean for cyber policy, and which we'll ask you about in a sec. But just following on from Joe's response there, is there, even if it's kind of not particularly politicized or ideological at this point, I'm wondering to what extent is the fact that as an opposition party and opposition MPs, you are not exposed to the kind of briefings that you get once you end up working on cyber policy in government. So once I don't know if being exposed to that more, might you end up in a position where the responses change because of political preferences? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I think there is a fair point to that, and Alexander will be better placed to comment on the extent to which access to high-level security briefings changes opinions once politicians come into play. But I think on the whole, I would completely agree with Joe's analysis. And I think the work and the research that we've undertaken with our Digital Dawn report and looking at allied nations trends across the globe, that is very consistent in saying it is hardly ever a political issue. There is a recognition of the market failures. There's a recognition that actually this shift of responsibility to those with the broader shoulders is happening across the board. There is a greater trend of cyber regulation, a greater trend of putting liability on firms and on individuals within firms. I think that is a global trend across the Western world, or the advanced cyber world. And I wouldn't expect that to change as fundamental drivers. I think, again, to the points that have been made previously in terms of government being more reactive, there might be different kinds of reactions that we're seeing from Labour politicians in power being exposed to the detailed briefings behind attacks and the threat landscape and whatever else that might entail. But I wouldn't expect a fundamental departure of the path that we're on and on the direction of cyber policy and cyber strategy that we have been seeing over the last couple of years.
So that's interesting. So that general, let's say, global trend or across allied nations of putting more emphasis on, I'd say the US national cyber strategy was much more interventionist than anything we've seen in the UK for a while. And as you said, put more burden on the private sector in terms of liabilities and the amount of regulation they might expect in the future. From my perspective, the UK is quite far behind that in terms of how prepared the last few governments have been to intervene in the kind of private cybersecurity market. What do you think about that?
I think in terms of real outcomes, absolutely. In terms of ambition, not so much. Because if we think about the extent of consultations, the extent of policy proposals that have been put forward on updating the NIS regulations and introducing greater responsibilities there, on enterprise IoT security, on, but if you looking at it from the outside, I think a lot of the implementation has been hamstrung by, shall we call it political infighting, to be diplomatic, and the lack of parliamentary time available to actually turn some of these proposals into legislation. So we've seen a lot of almost regulation by proxy through codes of conduct, and almost very ambitious, very competent, clever civil servants trying their best to turn an idea into something that has effect in the real world. So I don't think it's a philosophical difference. I think it's been a difference in ability to execute on that philosophy on the whole. Andrew is looking very quizzically at that.
Andrew, do you want to come in?
I think it's interesting whether there is a philosophical divide or not. I think for me, as Joe said, around the moment in 2016, which comes from Robert Hannigan's paper, which was published by RUSI, there was a clear moment where you say the market has failed, essentially. It doesn't work for cybersecurity. I think that's a broad agreement now that that was the case. And so there needs to be more activist implementations, let's say, whether that's been successful or not. I think for me, the whole of society has been really key here in that change, and it's often not linked in this way. So that is kind of this organizing concept for how you deal with cyber statecraft, how you deal with society and bring in private enterprise, academia, or different people, is that actually then the government becomes this kind of hierarchical actor, right, which is kind of trying as much as possible to do this coordination work. And I think this is where the whole society sometimes crumbles, because it can't deal with that, because it's simultaneously trying to direct strategy and policy, whilst at the same time trying to create consensus. And sometimes you just have to do things. And I think that's where the whole society gets really unraveled in itself, because it can't be seen to be doing things without the backing of industry or other civil actors, yet it must do things which must go against those same actors. So I think here this is an inherent tension in the way that cyber statecraft operates today, in that concept and in that way that is kind of philosophically framed about how you do cyber policy. So that's what my contortion was like. What came from, Kat. It wasn't necessarily exactly what you were saying.
No, but I think just to go down that rabbit hole ever so slightly for 30 seconds, I think that's a really good point. And again, I will keep referring back to Digital Dawn, because that is sort of our basis for a lot of, well, the lens through which we see the current state of cyber policy. But one of the kind of conclusions or observations we make is that everyone around the world talks about whole of society and whole of nation. The way in which that is defined and trickles down to the concrete allocation of responsibilities between the various actors is very different and not very clearly articulated at the moment. And if there is a sort of a time to revise or recommit for a Labour government, that would be one of the areas where we'd sort of say, by all means, continue whole of society, just be very clear what it is that you mean and what it is that you expect different parts of that ecosystem to take on, and where you draw the lines and the boundaries, because that will help with a more streamlined implementation of stuff, technical term, going forward, arguably. Jamie, can I talk about the manifestos?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a lot of people that want to ask about that, so I was going to come to that next. So yeah, from the Labour manifesto, is there anything that sort of caught your eye or anything that kind of didn't in terms of its absence?
So I will very briefly contextualize before I go straight onto the Labour manifesto. We've done some counting. We had lots of time, you see, in the pre-election period when civil service stopped speaking to us. So we did lots of crunching the numbers and what have you. Across the manifestos, all the parties' manifestos that were published in the pre-election period, cyber on the whole was mentioned a total of 10 times. That gives you a good idea of just how political or party political or not cyber as such was. However, when you look at Conservative and Labour manifestos and compare the mention of things like security, defence and crime in the 2019 manifestos to the 2024 manifestos, as a percentage of the overall word count, those words or those concepts rose by nearly half in 2024 as a reflection of the uncertain, volatile world that we live in. If you look at AI, hardly any mention of that in the 2019 manifestos on the whole, increased fivefold from a very low base in 2024. So, using manifestos as a tracker of salient issues or issues of popular public debate, quite a neat little thing by just counting keywords and doing that sort of quantitative analysis. So I think on the whole, what we found is that the way in which cyber and technology was viewed across the key parties' manifesto is very much through that lens of national security and through that lens of regulation of emerging technologies to unleash their potential, but in a safe kind of way, I think are the overarching themes. Within those, if you look at the Labour commitments, and some of them have been mentioned already, the overarching approach is that is the first duty of government to keep its citizens safe, which does reflect one of the Digital Dawn findings of aggregating public polling, which is that there is a public expectation for governments to keep them safe in cyberspace. So if you're looking at aligning messaging to where Labour is at in their thinking, there is a very nice way in which to do that in that regard. In terms of the security commitments, we've talked about the strategic defence review that will have a focus on hybrid threats and cyber and misinformation being part of that. We're obviously awaiting the details and the terms of reference for that. The security sprint has been mentioned. Again, would expect cyber to form part of that. We have already seen talks about this revised UK-EU security pact and potential collaboration on cybersecurity. That will be interesting to see, not least because the EU is obviously marching ahead with a lot of its cyber policy initiatives, potentially unburdened by the rational voice of the UK in those discussions. Who could possibly say? There is then increased powers for police and intelligence services to protect against threats like hostile espionage. And there is a commitment to an expanded fraud strategy, which will include online fraud and which also includes that commitment to look at working with technology companies to stop their platforms being used, which kind of aligns to that shift we've seen in cyber more broadly to kind of put the responsibility more at the source rather than on end users to do the right thing. In terms of technology regulation, technology growth aspects, there's a new industrial strategy on the horizon, and that will have sector plans under it. There is support for pro-innovation regulation, including through that new regulatory innovation office. There are commitments to put the AI Safety Institute on a statutory footing and introducing binding regulations on the most powerful AI models. And there is a commitment to building on the Online Safety Act. So, I mean, if you look at that, compare it to what Joe and Andrew and Alexander said, it sounds more like a story of incremental change, a story of continuation, a story of actually what has gone on before isn't all bad, even though it was done by a government of different color. And actually, we kind of want to see that in technology and cyber regulation, right? Because we want an evidence-based approach. We don't want the knee-jerk reactions. We don't want the out with all the old because we can do it better sort of thing, which might also explain that slightly less ideological or less party political focus during the election campaign, because it's quite hard to beat someone round the head with something that you fundamentally agree with. It's like, you have done it well, but we can do it better, is a pretty bad campaign message, even for a very non-political person. So yeah.
Would anyone like to make the case that within, maybe not right now, but within a few years, we will actually see a significant shift in cyber strategy or policy with a change in government?
Look, we're going into the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, right? That who knows what the future holds. If in the next 2.5 years, someone actually cracks encryption with a functioning quantum computer or what have you, all bets are off. So I'm not like, I don't think we can foresee no change at all. I'm not convinced it will be ideologically driven rather than in response to unprecedented technological evolution and change that is very difficult to foresee, even for incredibly clever people like all of us.
Alexander?
If I may, I mean, look, you know, I agree with Kat. I mean, I think you know, it's actually a good sign, but so much of this is relatively uncontested in party political terms. But that there has been this rising tide of interest and emphasis, indeed, as Kat said, reflecting on the language in the manifestos as well. I would just sort of put out some spaces which are at least open to less about left-right ideological differences, but differences that are material, right? So one difference is like, how much do you want the state to do stuff versus the private sector? And that is important. And that's, you know, something that, you know, has historically been a difference within the Labour movement, but it's also a difference within the Conservative movement as well. What is one's position on China? So positions on China, again, not easily taken on a left-right spectrum, but there are differences of view on this. And the other thing is just remembering a lot of regulatory policy and a lot of national security policy, you see some of the sharpest corrections after a crisis. So yes, we've had cyber attacks at scale and cyber incidents at scale in the United Kingdom, but we haven't yet had something that I think would approach a systemic crisis around a cyber incident. If we did face that, you know, might that then change the framework for government decision making? So I think this is less, Jamie, perhaps about, you know, what might we see in any future potential change of government, but it's actually how much do some of these major policy differences feature within government, and crucially, what is the role of surprise and crisis in fundamentally reframing policy choices? And we only need to look back to the financial crisis or to 9/11 just to see how much the policy window reframes itself very rapidly. Can I offer one final comment, which is I know that there's a grumble sometimes about primary legislation time. One of the truisms about government is there's very little time available for primary legislation. One of the most limited resources, apart from tea and biscuits in any Whitehall department, is the availability of primary legislation time and drafting time. So I think there is actually a natural disposition, and we should expect this rather than be surprised by it, a natural disposition to look to secondary legislation or to look at other tools, regulatory tools, other tools, to enact and shape and reshape the policy environment, including for something vital that I think it is worth us returning to. I realize we may not have time in this seminar, but capability. We will really, really need more and more people in central government who properly understand these issues in a full spectrum context, but also in individual verticals. And that's a work of a generation. It's not a work of a couple of years. It's not a work, dare I say it, of a single cyber strategy lifetime either.
Great, thank you, Alexander. So final question from me. Kat, I'll start with you and then go across. So if you had to go back to the original question to Joe, if you were briefing you know, all the ministers that have cyber somewhere in their portfolio and their special advisors and their senior officials, what's the one area of cyber policy that you would be telling them they need to prioritize?
You will expect me to say that, so this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. Reform the Computer Misuse Act. We've had over 5 years of back and forth on this issue, on reviews and consultations and engagement groups and what have you. And the issue of addressing the outdated nature of the Act that creates legal jeopardy for UK cybersecurity professionals still hasn't found a resolution. We are pretty positive because of the engagement we've had with the Labour front bench in the dying days of the last Parliament, that they might be keen and open to making progress on this quickly. But in the context of talking about the UK leadership in cyber, the UK as a global cyber power, having incredibly outdated legislation that governs the amazing UK cyber industry just doesn't wash and shouldn't wash for much longer. So one of the key asks will be reform and update the Computer Misuse Act, and then there is another longer list of adjacent priorities, all of which align to helping the Labour government achieve its 5 national missions.
Presumably that can also be sold to the new Home Secretary as part of their general emphasis on combating fraud as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Andrew, same question to you.
I think I would ask, what effects do you want to achieve? So almost bouncing off what Alexander was saying here, I don't think we've had a good view yet on what type of effects you want to achieve. So are you wanting to develop your alliances? What type of domestic effects do you want to achieve? I think these are the big questions that any incoming administration needs to ask itself. So it's a bit of a cop-out in terms of answering the question, but it's actually the question I would want to ask is, what do you actually want to do? Because I think it's very, very easy in the current climate to have incremental change because it works well. There's not a big political problem about it, and you just let it run on and tick on, and you interact when you need to. But that's not necessarily what we might need to do in the next 10, 15 years, as things may change quite significantly geopolitically.
Alexander?
Well, look, I as a classic securocrat, I have to worry about, the day after. So I would want to say, are you spending enough time on insurance policies? Are you thinking enough about crisis? And it speaks to one of the questions online, actually, about what would happen if we saw a real world security clash that included a cyber attack. That's something we need to be making sure we have enough time for. But I think the one ingredient I would throw out there, well, 2 ingredients perhaps, would be 2 things that have been articulated both in the manifesto, but also in speeches by David Lamy, the new Foreign Secretary, and by Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, which is how do you then think about the soft power dimensions of some of this, because it is material. Bit different perhaps to global Britain, but still Britain at large, as it were, and Britain engaged in equal partnerships with others. And the other angle actually is around green tech and climate, because one way of reanimating what is often a boring subject, but it's really important, which is how do you extend cybersecurity in a world dominated by the Internet of Things? Well, we're going to have lots of Internet of Things around smart homes, smart offices, green tech. How do we think about cybersecurity standards? How do we think about making sure that as part of that green tech revolution, cybersecurity and risk management is at its very heart?
Okay.
Yeah, obviously, I think all of those things are like sort of really great recommendations, and there are plenty of others that I'm sure we could and should raise. But I'll just give one other, which is cybercrime, and just say that however difficult it is, however transnational it is, whatever the sort of safe harbor jurisdiction problems that there are, the current level of national impact is unacceptable, and the new government should take another look at what a sort of coherent cyber statecraft, counter cybercrime strategy that achieves better outcomes should look like, and then try to execute it.
If I'm allowed to, I'll add my own, which is, I think, more scrutiny of the NTSC and the National Cyber Force in terms of the money that's being spent on their respective programs, because it seems increasingly closed to me. And I think from a kind of democratic perspective, I think we need more transparency. Thank you so much to our excellent panel today. It was, yeah, some really fascinating insights. And to the audience, please look out for more events as part of the Cyber Statecraft event series. We will have some more listings for the autumn very soon. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you very much for sharing, Jamie. Much appreciated. Thanks all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Likewise, thank you. Bye-bye.